Welcome back to Overhaul Overland. Thank you guys for your comments, for your support, and it's been a lot of fun and a lot of hard work making this series. The idea behind Overhaul Overland is a real educational process to show you what would you need to do to a vehicle. Certainly not to do everything we've done on this vehicle. That would be excessive. Really, this is a vehicle that I'm investing in to keep for a long period of time. I'm also using it to showcase what we can do and how we would do it, partnering with different local specialists, so that you can see a process that you can approach and adopt when you're looking for a second-hand vehicle. I mean, why do we go for these older trucks? The reason is because of simplicity. When you're going to far-flung remote places, you actually want a simple vehicle. You want a vehicle that's not complex with electronics. You want a vehicle that you can get repaired by any of the local workshops and garages. And the Toyota is a brand that leads itself deep into a network of most continents. So you've got access to spares, you've got access to people who can help you repair the vehicle. So yeah, this journey is really about how we can impart our knowledge using specialists that are going to share their knowledge and their wisdom and their experience with you. So on with the show. We finished up with Goch & Cooper and we're now taking the truck back to Sneeman 4x4. They've already started stripping the vehicle, but we want to focus on the key components that you'd need to look at when you're going to prepare a vehicle like this, so you can get a good understanding of how it's done, what you need to do, and work with a plan. Okay, so far we've actually got the vehicle into a position where we are ready to take the gearbox out. And to do that, we've taken the prop shafts off, all the bolts around the engine have been loosened. Actually, the front suspension's out, the front diff's out, the rear axle's out, so the vehicle's coming apart quickly. And Joubert, you pulled a lot apart. Did you have any problems when you were pulling stuff apart here?
Yeah, I actually wanted to talk to you about something because I found something on the back part of the chassis. It looked like they welded the back part in.
But you know, that's... Okay, so that means I've got half and half. Yeah, I think we might win this one.
Yeah. I know this car.
You know this car. That I've heard that once before. So what we want to do is drain the oil. The oil tells a story, especially if it's been in the gearbox for a long time. And you might just pick up little bits that come out with the oil. You might look for the coloration of the oil. It was probably changed about 30,000 kilometers ago. So it's always good to check that. Yeah, we've got the drain here. So shall we just loosen it off and try not to put oil on everyone? The intrepidation of the oil coming out. There we go. So straight away what we're seeing, there's a little bit of black coloration in the oil that came out first off, which is probably signs of a bit of wear in the gearbox that you'd expect. And for the rest, the oil looks pretty good. I'm looking actually on this is a magnet here, which normally picks up any particles. And if you look on my finger, there's a bit of sludge, which I sort of would expect to find. The magnet's doing its jobs. There is wear and tear that happens in the gearbox. Obviously, if you don't change your oils often enough, that accentuates the wear. And yeah, it's not looking too bad really, but the real test is when we pull the gearbox apart. Now what we're seeing is the oil's quite dark if you look in here. And as I said, I saw traces. If you look here, you can see my fingers pulling through some of this. What we'd see is probably wear and tear from the engine, the gearbox rather. And it's interesting to look at that because, as you say, the first time you drain oil, it's something that often gets missed. And to put it into a clean bucket and actually look carefully, and here you'll see that this is what we're picking up. So nothing untoward, no bits fell out, which is good, which can happen. But yeah, so all good. We're going to just take the oil out the transfer box as well. Now quite often, as you find, it gets tight. You've got a steel plug, you've got aluminium, and there's a bite on it. And what I've often seen people do, sadly, is take chisels and start trying to chisel this nut off. Now the nut's not very thick, so when you take a socket to get the grip on there, it often slips off. And it's very simple. If you just took a hammer and you smack it on the corners, You just sharpen those corners up, which means it grips a bit more on the socket, and the shock load will often just loosen it. So, just... and it comes loose. So, it just saves doing a lot of damage to something that you need to keep really in good condition. And the bottom one...
Yeah,
right. Okay, now this is a thicker oil. Again, we're getting the same sort of traces that we're seeing in the oil, which is the dark residue of wear. And as you see it falling, you're seeing that you are getting residue of what's traces of wear. Now that's expected. Metal on metal is going to produce some sort of residue. What we'd be sad to see is bits and pieces falling out of there. And the truth will be revealed once we actually strip it down. Most of the ones we've pulled apart, we've really seldom had problems. It's normally seals.
Yeah, what I also found when I took the Propshaft off, the oil was coming out through the nut.
Yes.
And there's a little O-ring inside there that people don't change.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, that's important because oil coming out and the blocked breathers on the gearbox and transfer box are often overlooked, and you need to keep those checked, clear, and free. Great. All right. Well, that's probably most of what we need out. The rest will come out when they wash it.
Yeah.
Now, if we shake the car, the gearbox falls out. That's what you told me, isn't that the case?
Yeah, but I'll stand outside.
Okay. All right. Let's give the car a shake. Okay, so what we're seeing here, there's a lot of oil and residue, and of course on the bearing there's grease coming out. So the release bearing looks like it's losing grease, which is not good in the long term.
No.
And of course the oil coming out here is either rear main engine oil seal or gearbox.
Input shaft seal,
Yeah, the input shaft. Now what we've spotted is where our spigot bearing goes. That's completely worn. So that shaft's going to need to be changed completely. It's too badly worn, and once that's worn, it's got a small bearing it sits in to locate the shaft. The bearing sits in the middle of the flywheel, and of course now there's movement. And any time there's movement, it's never good for anything trying to run nice and smoothly.
Yeah.
So yeah, that will be changed. Anything else you can spot?
No. Not really.
I mean, the box drove well. It wasn't.
No, it was smooth.
It was smooth.
I don't foresee a lot of problems inside. It was quiet also, so.
Yeah, probably the fifth gear, but worn like we suggested. Alaric did pick that up. It's clunky.
Also, what I used to find on the 4x4 lever is that blue seat that crumbles of old age.
Okay.
And
I think that's always something to check because it's actually easy to get in there and check it. So, the gear shift needs to feel good. It needs to go into first, second, drop into the middle. So you can hit third and fourth without having to have the lever flop around. And sometimes it's a simple, small fix. If that little blue support is damaged, it's going to cause
you won't be able to shift your 4x4.
Yeah. So, and of course here as well, you've also got another one seat in the main gearbox, first, second, third, fourth.
Yes.
And if I pull this one out, that's the sort of cone where it sits in, and then you've got this washer.
Yeah, that's basically the base of it. But like I said, it gets hard from the heat and the oil, and then just one day it breaks apart. And then you have no gears.
So it's amazing how simple something like this gets overlooked, and it's probably not an expensive part to replace it all. And if this was just changed, and once it breaks and you can't engage gears, you've got a big problem on the road.
Yeah.
But if you know what to do, or more importantly, if it's changed before you go, is one of the things, then it's not going to be a problem. So it's a case of just looking at little things that can be easily looked at. Not always necessary to pull the gearbox out,
No.
but certainly on this case we want to, on the mileage, pull it out and have a look-see.
Yeah.
So now the gearbox is out, this whole space here where the gearbox and transfer box sat is now good for us to have a look. The body itself I don't have any worries about, but what I am looking at here is the clutch. This is the clutch cover. The clutch plate sits between the flywheel. The flywheel is this, you only see part of it here. And what I'm seeing is the gear. Now this gear is where the starter motor engages and spins the engine. And it's important to check that that gear, the teeth are actually nice and they're not sharp and they're not damaged in any way, because that just hampers the starting of the car when you're trying to start. A worn starter motor or a damaged ring gear, sometimes what people will do is they'll repair the starter motor, but they won't actually check the ring gear, and then you just damage that again. So this comes off completely. We then can look behind the flywheel and we can actually look and see whether the rear main engine oil seal, which sits at the back of the engine up here, is leaking. I suspect it is. It's quite common, and often the dirt gets in underneath there, and of course this big packing of foam here tries to stop and keep some of the muck out, but that's been compromised with oil, so we'll change that if we can get one. And then the rear main oil seal we're going to check very carefully, and more so when we pull the engine apart. We've got the clutch slave cylinder here. So this is bolted to the side of the gearbox, and that's what actually activates the clutch fork, and that works the clutch. Now this slave cylinder, these slave cylinders get tired with age, and what people don't realize is that sometimes you get dust and dirt that creeps inside this rubber cover, or the rubber cover gets compromised. And this is one component I always change on a build for an overland truck. It's a small item, you can keep the old one as a spare if you want to, but if this leaks or if this gives you problems on the clutch circuit, it's really a headache in the bush to fix. And it's better just to put a new one, know you've got a new one in there, take the old one, you can pull it apart, you can put a new rubber seal in, you can keep it as a spare. But that's one of the weak points. And of course checking all the lines that the fluid comes through to the clutch slave cylinder. It's just about meticulously going through everything and looking for problems. Where are there problems? Where can we fix stuff? What's good? The fuel lines, the brake lines, checking all of them to make sure that we've looked for any problems. Now's our chance. We've taken out the clutch, and we're seeing on the clutch cover traces of oil, and that's actually moved through as we suspected. Sadly, it's actually gone onto the clutch plate itself. And once the oil goes onto the clutch plate, it's a matter of time before you actually damage it. You're heating up the clutch, it's not gripping. The flywheel was machined last time that it actually got changed, and there's no hot spots on the flywheel. So the clutch hasn't been slipped dramatically. Now, I know I'm gentle on the clutch, and it's very important that when you take your foot and you're driving, you get your foot off the clutch, let the clutch completely bite, and then apply power. And I see a lot of people when I'm doing training don't do that. And you've got a heavy vehicle, and that will show signs when you don't do that and you're starting to take your foot off the clutch and you're applying power, you actually start slipping the clutch. And of course then you build up heat. And you'll see the telltale signs on the flywheel when you start seeing blue hot marks. And if it's really bad, it'll start showing signs of cracks. And then of course the flywheel needs to be taken out, it needs to be surface ground, machined, and then you start again with a new clutch. So of course we want to make sure we start again without the oil leaks, which we will do. Checking the clutch itself, the pressure plate, looking for any signs of play on the springs, which there isn't. The main center part is still stiff, so the clutch itself is good. It's just sad that the oil has actually compromised this clutch. It's a fortified clutch, so it's got the sort of little bits on the back and the clutch material in the front. It's not a bad clutch. It's quite hard on the foot, being quite a strong clutch, so you have to get used to that. But we will fit back a heavy-duty Tamer clutch when we put it back, after we fix the oil leaks, of course. Like much, the rear main wasn't really leaking. So if anything, Maybe a bit on the sump, eh?
Yeah, but also can be the...
When it's spinning, yeah.
I think the main leak was basically on the sump.
Yeah.
It's still...
This still looks good.
Yeah.
But that was changed. So it's important just to identify while you're stripping. Really, this is your one chance to gather all the information that tells you the story about the engine. And it's so often missed. You know, everything gets stripped and pulled apart, and then you don't really always know what were the causes. You know, and here we're looking at the rear main oil seal. It's pretty dry around the seal. This would all be wet if it was leaking. So that's not the rear main oil seal leaking. Possibly a bit of oil coming out from where the sump seals. Okay, that's possible. There was also a lot of blow-by in this engine, a lot of pressure built up in the sump. And of course, that's going to push oil out where it can. Now, the seal being quite strong, if that seal in the sump is not so good, it's going to leak oil out there as well. So, you know, this is telling us, stripping off, we're basically going to now drain the oil once we've put it on the engine stand, and then pull off the auxiliaries. So we can leave the cylinder head, the actual block itself, and the sump in place, and that'll go off to engineering. And that's what they'll strip down, and then we'll have a whole story about that. But yeah, well done. 10 minutes, not bad, eh?
Yeah.
You've got a good team. Guys are great.
Yeah.
Some of the parts that we have to change, we're not always able to get brand new parts. And you know, here's a timing belt cover. It's broken a lug off at the bottom. We definitely want to fix that, and it could be repaired with a washer. But actually, I'd like another one. And if I can't get a new one, I'll take a good second-hand one. It's fine. But more critically, you know, on a power steering pump, I wouldn't do that. I would absolutely want to take it apart, refurbish it, or replace it, depending on the wear and tear. You know, so parts like injector pumps, we're not just going to replace. They're expensive. It's not realistic to replace them. They can come apart, get stripped down, parts changed inside, and of course refurbished. And so you are putting together the engine. So you're looking at all the things that are worn and making sure that you cover not only the basics, the obvious things, but the little things in detail, the little pipes that run around, the rubber pipes, the steel pipes. I've noticed that the steel pipes on this, for the heater system, are quite badly corroded. And I don't know how thin they are inside. So it's not worth the risk. We're just going to put new ones. Okay, so I want to drain the oil because I really want to see what it'll tell me. I know the oil's pretty thick. I've looked at it on the dipstick, and I haven't changed it for about 10,000 kilometers. So it's 5,000 more than what I would. But let's see what it's got to tell us. See, Joubert's staying away because he doesn't want to get too dirty. This is what can get really dirty. So whenever you're doing it, just be mindful. Oh, there we go. So what I'm seeing straight away, I would expect it to be black. The consistency is quite thick. Probably a little bit thicker than I would like to have, and I know that the unburnt diesel is mixing in those diesel particles, those carbon particles are thickening up the oil. And of course, that I'm quite sure when we take the sump off, we're going to find a nice layer of sludge on the inside of the sump. And that's really important to clean up, because the oil pickup that sucks the oil from the bottom here and pushes it through the oil pump and around the engine, once that gets clogged up, then you've got a real problem in the engine, because now the oil is not getting to the top of the engine. So, yeah, I'm not seeing anything on the sump plug. The true test is going to be when we strip all this off, and then we'll see inside. So we really want to go through some of the components that we've taken out the vehicle, just to show you in more detail what we're finding and more what you'd want to look for. The brakes are critical, and I find that over years people don't actually bleed brake fluid often enough. Yeah. Wouldn't you say the same? I mean, it's...
Yeah, in 9 out of 10 cars that comes here, the fluid is black.
Yeah.
So then it's already turned water.
So brake fluid's hydroscopic. It basically absorbs moisture. And the important part to know is once you leave that sitting in your brake system for years and you don't flush it out, we'd say every year, and on an expedition vehicle, depending on how you drive it and how you use it, maybe even more often. But the big problem you get is we've got a brake caliper here that we split apart. Okay, so normally it would sit like that, and it would have these pistons in. So when you push your foot on the pedal, these pistons push out against the brake pad and actually against the disc, and that's what stops your car. So when you pull this apart, what we're looking for is to actually have a look at the piston itself and see if there's any corrosion. These are hard chrome pistons, and you normally find the corrosion mostly where on the top edges.
Part, where it basically sits the whole time.
Yeah, so you've got a dust cover. You've got a dust cover which goes over it, and the piston sits inside. Okay, and then you've got a dust cover. Now what happens over time is these dust covers perish and people don't change them. Then of course you're going to get dirt and you're going to get moisture coming in. And of course once you get that, the first part to wear here is going to be exposed to the water, the corrosion, the mud, the dirt. And as these pistons move in and out, they pull all that back in till eventually inside gets compromised and you get the corrosion build up inside here. And we've seen that all too often.
Yeah, too much.
And then you've got your seal around the piston. So you can imagine there's your rubber seal, sits in the caliper, and that's what keeps the brake fluid from leaking all over the brake pads. Now, once the brake fluid leaks out here, it's too late. I mean, you've lost brake fluid, you've probably find that the caliper's compromised with rust and dirt, and of course, all too often, this never gets looked at. I mean, you know, how many times have we had people come in and the brakes, you look at them and for years and years, the brake pads have just never been, or the calipers have never been serviced. So it's a critical component and worth looking at. Now we move to the back one. Now the back's got a single piston, okay? The front has got 4 pistons. So here's the back one, single piston, same again, same dust cover. Now we can see how the dust cover sits here. And actually if I pull it out, you'll see there's our dust cover. Now these are still intact, they're not torn, they're not broken. And that's actually showing that the wear on here is still in really good condition. There's no corrosion, there's no rust. I mean, we'll clean these up, eh? Clean them up, and we'll clean inside here, give it a polish with some 1200 water paper, put new seals in, put a new kit in, and completely rebuild these so that they will be good to go for a long, long time. What other problems have you seen on these?
Well, on the back one you've got these 2 sliders. And the same principle. If you see the grease are here, it's very sticky. And that's why sometimes you get uneven
wear on the brake pads.
pads.
So this caliper is actually, it's slide, the actual piston sits in.
Yeah.
So we just do this quickly. So as Joubert was explaining, your brake pads sit in here, either side, and you've got your brake disc. And the caliper, this caliper slides on these bolts here. And what will end up happening is when these seize up, you get that uneven brake pad wear. We see it often. And of course, people don't actually check the rubber boot here. And this little rubber boot is there. You just grab that.
Yeah.
This little rubber boot is there to actually keep this from getting all the dirt inside. So it's a small point to check, but if it's done properly, and most workshops will pull it out, strip it down completely, and check that it wears, that this is cleaned, it's not corroded, put some grease in, and if need be, change this rubber. And these little rubbers push in, they're a little bit difficult to get in.
That's the whole thing.
It goes right through, yeah. So you can see it goes all the way through there, and you've got to push it out. So, yeah. Something to look at.
But also, if it doesn't release correctly, the brakes will get hot and will glaze, and then you get brakes that squeals.
So when we say release, what we're saying is the brake pads, when you take your foot off the brake pedal, the pads actually, it should pull back ever so slightly to release the pad. So the pad doesn't actually sit running on the disc. Because as you said, then it's just building up heat.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happens here when this is stuck. It doesn't release it. And the same can happen on the front brake pads when the pads actually jam on the pins that hold them in. You've got 2 locking pins that hold these pads. And then sometimes these pads jam as well, and we see the same problem. They actually glaze over and the discs get hot, they go blue, and then of course the braking is really compromised.
Yeah.
We did speak about the brake pipe. Now, this has done 450,000 kilometers. We're definitely going to change these. It's a rubber pipe, and I think you said the inside is what really collapses.
Yes. Yeah, it's basically it's rubber, and with brake fluid, it will start to expand.
Yeah, and then of course you don't always see it because the outside, if you look at it, still looks okay. but you don't know until actually it's compromised. So yeah, it's not an expensive part worth changing. Now let's talk about the rubbers that support the engine, the gearbox, the front diff housing. These are the rubbers that don't often always get looked at, and as you mentioned that the oil comes on and compromises it. Here's our engine mount.
Yeah, basically this hides away in this little bucket, but if you take it off, you'll see it actually started to thaw.
So this metal plate bonded to the rubber is pulling away, and actually not far from completely coming apart. So yeah, lucky we changing them. But again, you know, when you're trying to do work on your car, it's not about rebuilding everything. It's often about building in preventative maintenance.
That's maintenance.
Yeah, and maintenance is, on most vehicles that are driven around, is a begrudged expense. People don't want to spend the money. But if you come through and you actually look at it, you discuss it with your technicians and you say, guys, what do you recommend I do? I want to keep the car for a long time. How do I maintain the car? And then work through a priority of lists you're going to do. Maybe change the engine mounts, the gearbox mounts, the front axle mounts, and then work through ball joints, and then work through wheel bearings. So that slowly you're renewing the parts on the car. Okay? I mean, they last a long time.
Yeah.
So we've got the engine mount, our main gearbox mount. Now, it doesn't show it so much now, but it's actually a bit compromised, and it's starting to tear away here.
Yeah.
And again, from oil. So we had quite a big oil leak on this car, we saw. And that causes this to swell, and the rubber softens, and of course then it doesn't actually do its job properly. And this mount.
Yeah, that's a good example of what oil does to rubber.
Yeah. So again, you can see this was probably drenched in oil for a long time. And it's actually compromised the rubber. The rubber starts swelling, it starts just not doing its job again. And of course, that's a critical mount. So Joubert, we've got here the front, part of the front stub axle. The parts we're going to look at changing here, upper and lower ball joints.
Yes.
And this would come what, as we knock this out?
Yeah, basically it's got a circlip, you press it out.
Yeah. And then
Clean
the new
it
one
up
goes
a
in,
bit,
keeping the actual main support here. And the bottom one bolts off.
That's
again,
the easy one.
And that's a complete one that gets changed. And then the big thing is the wheel bearings on these vehicles. It's a solid bearing.
Solid bearing, so most people never...
They never change it.
Yeah, they never change them, and they actually leave it until it breaks. But where does it break?
Yeah, that's always...
next to Toyota or in the bush?
So again, it's one of those bearings. It's difficult to test. It doesn't have adjustment, but you kind of need to look at the mileage and go, what am I going to do with this truck? How am I going to use this truck? And would I invest the money in changing all the wheel bearings? Bite the bullet, spend the money, and change the parts. Well worth it. And when you've got a seal here that comes off, which gets compromised, we've got the solid lock ring. And then we've got inside here.
Your ABS ring.
This is our ABS ring, And then that's the bearing. Now, as you can see, this bearing doesn't come apart until we almost force it out, and then it normally does break apart. You push it in as one complete unit, but when you're taking it out, they normally fall apart, and then it's compromised. So this all gets pushed out, this wheel bearing, this is one solid bearing which gets pushed in here, and it is a big, strong bearing. It doesn't often go. But as Joubert said, the question is how long, how far, and when? I guess 450,000, it's fair to say they've done their life.
Yeah, I would say if you do town driving every 200.
Yeah, you know, 200,000 is still a good mileage to do.
Yeah, if you're a lot of gravel and water driving every 100.
And that's where bearings get compromised because the seals get tired, this dust seal gets compromised, you're going through water, water gets sucked in, and of course now you don't actually know how much damage has been done inside here. And we'll see it on the back ones. So this is the rear bearing, and this bearing is compromised. This bearing is all rusty. It's had water in.
Yeah.
And you can see Here's our lock ring, our ABS ring, and our lock ring. But this bearing is something I would change more often, because this one does take a lot more work. It's the back of the vehicle, and as you can see, this bearing's probably been running. Now, it's difficult to tell a bearing. There's a noise you'll get. You need a trained ear to listen to it, to actually understand that there's a noise coming, and sometimes we hear a noise and it's difficult to detect where the noise is coming from. But with experience, you'll drive the car, you'll get a feel, you'll get a noise, you'll hear it, then you can start isolating it. How else would you check it? Put on the lift?
Yeah, play, but yeah, with these solid bearings, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
It's usually when I test drive a car in the service, I'll pick it up.
Yeah.
But you must also be careful, it can be also a tire noise.
There we go. So, you know, sometimes trying to understand where the noise is coming from can be a minefield. And most people have had some experience, unfortunately not always good, where you're trying to track a noise down. It's not easy. It really isn't. So in this case, we're working again with mileage. And again, if I was taking an old car like this, as we are, and we're going to build it up to keep it for a long time, it's set in the program. We want to say it's done its mileage. This is done very well, I imagine, the life of the vehicle. And the other part we're looking at is when we look inside, where the bearing sits through here, these are the handbrake shoes. So you can actually see inside here, it's compromised. And what I'm looking at, and what we look at when we check, is the coloration on the side where the bearing sits. So this bearing will run inside here, and we're seeing that it's gone from a brown to a blue.
It got some heat.
It's got heat. There's dirt inside there. The grease has been compromised.
Yeah.
And that's really a good sign that it's going to be changed. And on the brakes, we'll take these. We will change these shoes because they end up wearing a bit thin.
Yeah, it's also breaking up at the top.
Yeah, so on the brake shoes here, quite often these shoes will last a long time. I mean, the handbrake doesn't get used all the time unless you're trying to do handbrake turns and James Bond style, but you know. Here, this shoe is actually starting to wear apart and compromise. And it's dirt getting in there.
Yeah, also people don't take the disc off on services and clean that. And that's actually the part that all the water and builds up over time. And if you clean that every service, it will last. But like Paul said, it's just for handbrake. So
So effectively, you've got this going on here, and this is where the handbrake works on here. More often than not, this gets a ridge, and you can see it hasn't been cleaned in a long time. But normally you'd take it off, you'd sand this nice and clean, you'd sand here, you'd blow this all out with a rinse it with a brake cleaner, so you get all the dust on the ground, and just wash it all off basically. And by doing that and checking all the levers are not seized up, because that also happens. These seize up, the handbrake cable seizes up, and that's what doesn't get done often enough. And it's kind of a halfway stop between doing the job properly and just, you know, a half job.
Yeah, it's a bit of a bush mechanic style.
Yeah, I can see it's been repaired. So these little springs here, what ends up happening on these little springs, it's got a little collar basically that you can twist and loosen the spring off. And if you twist it off, and now here we've got this little collar and we've got the spring. This holds the brake shoe on. Now I can see, you know, as it wears, guys will make a plan because they can't always find these, and then they compromise it. And what you don't want is this to come apart and then to actually start locking up this wheel, and you've got bits floating around here, because that also happens when these clip off or jump off because they're worn. Really what it's about is maintaining your vehicle and understanding what needs to be looked at and what you should probably ask your guys to do. You know, if they're doing the brakes, have you taken my handbrake? Have you serviced the handbrake, cleaned the handbrake shoes, checked them? I guess that's really where we're going. And we're going to replace all this, so it's going to be nice. So when we started looking at the vehicle, Joubert was showing us how we test the prop shafts in place when they're still attached to the differential and to the transfer box. So now that it's out, we can see clearly that actually we've got a grease nipple over here, which is for this joint here. And quite often what we find is when these come in, they're not greased properly, okay? There's still grease packed in here, and it doesn't get cleaned out, and when you pump it full of grease, you want that to squidge out and push out all the dirt away so you can clean it. Get rid of all the grease that's tied in there. And if that's done properly, regularly, like at every service, you should never change these. Now, when we tested it in the car, we were actually trying to check that sort of movement. Twisting, holding one and twisting the other, okay? Now that it's out, we actually can start checking more movement. And this joint's still okay. It's a little bit tight on here. It's got a little bit of a notch. But that's what you can check more of when the prop shaft comes out. And then we've got the sliding joint. I know that's often what people over-grease these, eh?
Oh, it's like this seal will pop out if it has a seal.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So because the seal's popped out, now this gets compromised here, then the joint gets greased, sometimes too much grease, and that's also not good because now that grease is pushing pressure against the two flanges.
Yeah.
And then of course you've got all the dirt going inside here. So that's another thing to look at, make sure that's okay. And we've got the double joint at the back here. Now, again, I can feel there's a tight spot here. There's a tight spot. So what it's doing inside here, we'll find that these little roller bearings that sit inside these cups have probably dried up, got no grease at some stage, and actually they've worn out. And that's what will happen to this shaft is they'll put new joints in all 1, 2, 3, and then and probably the slider as well if there's play. It's not too bad. And then they'll take the prop shaft and balance it. And that's when you see these little tags that get welded on its weight that they're adding to the prop shaft to balance it. And that's actually quite critical because if a prop shaft's got a play on a CV, on a U-joint here, you'll pick it up in the car. Eh?
Yeah, I definitely feel, I always say the vibration will come through the seat.
Through the seat, yeah. So it's a good way to understand that when you're driving your car and you feel this vibration through the seat, once it's noisy and you pull away and you're hearing something, that's almost too late. Yeah. And I've seen them where they're broken. Now, if this breaks and it falls down, let's just say I don't want to be in the car. It can be a disaster.
Luckily, it will just go with the car.
Yeah, unless it's the other one, the front one. Because if the front one drops and it hits the ground and digs in, so it can be a really dangerous problem, and it can also be really difficult to sort of, it's not a difficult repair, you can change these quite easily, but it's better to change it, balance it, and do the job properly. And we do that on all the prop shafts that we do. And again, when you've balanced a prop shaft, there's less wear and tear on the bearings at the differential and the transfer box. Because that's what, you know, when a bearing on the diff is worn, you know, the diff gets fixed and people don't always think about what caused that. Yeah. And more often.
I've got a rule, I send this in for balancing when I do a diff or a gearbox.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you compromise that collapsible spacer on the diff.
Okay, so good way to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so the cooling system we know is radiator cap. We're going to change the radiator on this because it has a history of overheating. That's one of the key elements. There isn't an upgraded radiator like you can get from some of the models that Terrain Tamer do, which is a great radiator. But this particular model, we're going to put a brand new Toyota radiator in, which is good, nothing wrong. And then, of course, we start looking at where are the weak points in the cooling system for a truck of this mileage. Now, all the rubber hoses we change regardless. Heater hoses, radiator hoses.
Yeah, that's a small rule you must apply to your.
Yeah.
When you do an engine, change the stuff.
Because you know, if a hose goes and you lose a hose on a brand new engine, you've just thrown away all that money because you're never going to catch it quick enough.
Yeah.
And now, the other things we look at is we've got the top radiator hose coming onto this housing here. And we need to check that this corrosion can clean off. It hasn't eaten in, because it does, it eats in here. Hey?
Yeah.
And once it eats into this aluminium, then it's compromised. And of course it won't seal properly. So we check all that. Thermostat, we put new. We don't even, that's a given. Okay, because there's your rubber seals get compromised, and I don't think this has been changed in a long time. These are the metal pipes that run around the engine.
Yeah.
Now,
it's got the standard corrosion here.
which is normal, yeah.
Yeah, but If I can see inside, that will be a nice add-on.
What you normally find inside here is that you get rust building up. And of course, when you're not running antifreeze in the engine, you find that that's your compromise. These metal pipes need antifreeze. It's basically, it's not just keeping the engine cool or stopping it from being too hot. It lubricates the inside of the engine. It lubricates the water pump, and it stops this sort of corrosion happening. So what we're finding here is where hoses have been compromised, they've been left too long probably.
Yeah.
And then of course it corrodes away, and then you don't know from the inside. And as Joubert says, we don't know how much of this has been compromised. So we'll aim to change these. And I think this one,
you can see inside.
You can see inside, there's already corrosion buildup. Okay. So well worth changing and not compromising. The water pump I know we changed a while back. So this is a almost brand new Toyota pump. And I can feel, you know, if I take an old pump out like this, we won't keep it as a spare, because generally what happens is it's already had water through it, and then if it compromises the seal, then you know you put in the pump that stood out for a while and put it into your engine as a spare, and then it leaks. So I always carry one on expedition. It's one of the things we always say to people: put a new one in, carry maybe a generic on the trip with you, because this is a showstopper. When the water pump leaks, your car's not going far anywhere. So yeah, this was still good, so we can't show you much. It's got a metal impeller. I've had some plastic ones as well, which over time also tend to wear. Now, this is a pulley that fails often.
Yeah.
And this is the Aircon adjuster pulley. And if you run it, it's probably good for the bin.
If your wheel bearing sounds like that,
so yeah, it's true. This bearing has been compromised. Now it's a small bearing on here, and the reality is the small bearing sits inside there, and what ends up happening is people over adjust this tensioner for the air conditioning instead of changing the belt. The belts get hard over time, and it doesn't take much to put a good quality belt on. And if it's the alternator, same thing. Put a pair of matched belts on. Yeah. And we've learned that lesson, because if the belts aren't matched, do you want to explain what a matched belt is?
Basically, matched belts are cut from the same batch. So if you don't put a match, the one will be longer than the other one. So you will adjust it, and the one will be tight, the other one will be loose.
Yeah.
So 9 out of 10 times, or 10 out of 10 times, you will get the one belt just climbing off. And if that comes off, it will break the fan and
compromise your radiator. So you know, it has a double pulley. It runs twin belts for a reason, and it's important, as Joubert says, to use a matched pair of belts. And of course, this pulley, we're going to change it. This is quite often. In fact, we change it more often than not.
Yeah, no, we change them. I used to just buy them from Toyota. Because in early years, you couldn't get them, and some guys bought the cheap bearing, and they wouldn't even last 5,000 Ks.
Yeah.
And if this breaks, it goes through the radiator.
Yeah. So, you know, it's a small thing, but it's actually a big thing in the big picture. So where you think you're saving a bit of money, you often can cost yourself a big expense down the road. And that's where experience and knowledge will actually guide you to make those decisions, those critical decisions, so that you do it properly. Now, I know our alternator has done very well, because you put a set of brushes in.
Yes.
And they were worn down to nothing. So I imagine it probably has been like that from new. It's worked hard. It's a critical component for a vehicle. So we'll put a new one on. You know, it still works, it still charges. If I was using the vehicle around town and I wasn't traveling on it, I would say, well, you could run with it, and if it stopped working, you're going to find out your car doesn't start, and then you could fix it. It's not a safety critical component, but on an expedition it is, because you need power in your car. You need to make sure your battery is fully charged for the starter, to start the car, to charge up auxiliaries, to get you out of where you are. So a very, very important part in the vehicle.
And if you do expedition, you can upgrade it.
Yeah, good point. You know, this is, I can't read here, but it's probably not a big 65 amps.
Yeah.
It's not a big alternator. And when you start drawing extra power for secondary batteries to be charged, it's nicer to actually put a bigger alternator on. And I think Tamer, well, I know they do nice upgrade alternators. And I know we're putting a bigger one on this truck. So another critical component, CV joints.
Yes.
Yeah.
While you drive, they stand still. They never work.
Yeah.
No, most people forget about that.
So how would you test it if you're driving the car?
Basically, to test it, you'll feel vibrations if there's wear on it, or you full lock your steering.
Full lock left to right.
Left to right, and make basically tight circles. Then if it's worn out, it will make a clunking noise.
That's really worn.
Yeah. Then
when it happens.
If that happens, then yeah, that should have been done a long time ago.
But I think on the maintenance side, we often see different types of CV boots used.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between these two.
I personally prefer the Toyota boots. They're much stronger, thicker. This is the inside one, this is the outside one. The aftermarket one is very, very soft.
Yeah.
Some people change the Toyota one out for a soft one when they do quite a big lift on the car.
Right.
Because then your angle is quite
aggressive.
yes.
Yeah.
And the Toyota one tends to, on this clamp, tends to pull off when your angle is too tight.
Okay. Yeah.
But then if you do that, go and look for a quality boot, not cheapies.
And that's the thing, parts come in a variance of quality. And I think it's important that when you're having someone fit parts to your car, understand what are the parts, where they're bought from, who's supplying them. Are they Tamer? Are they Toyota? Is it an aftermarket part that has good service life? Now on the we strip this ECV down because typically we'd pull them out if we're doing like we're doing on the front suspension. Yeah. And now, would you want to explain what we're going to look for on the CV here?
Okay. This part goes into your diff center.
Yeah.
So basically the side shaft, this is almost like the side shaft seal runs here.
Yeah.
And you can see the wear there. So either this needs to be polished, and if it doesn't come out, it needs to be replaced.
Yeah.
On the inside, you'll have these bearings running inside. You don't get a lot of wear on the inner CV because they basically stay in a straight line.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can see there's movement inside, but not a lot of wear.
And you can see there's a polished edge where you can see it's.
Yeah.
But not if I feel it, there's very little wear at all.
Nothing. It's more like the bearing just polished it.
So and on the splines we'd look at as well.
Yeah,
which also,
we'll look on where this goes in. We'll check the sharpness of the spline.
Yeah.
If that's worn out, you have to change it.
Okay, so that's good. These not often.
Yeah.
And of course they can be supplied separately as well.
Yes.
Or you can get a complete drive shaft with both CVs on that I think we're getting from Tamer.
Yeah, funny enough, if you buy the CVs from Toyota, then it's actually cheaper to buy a complete shaft rather than repairing it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's just economics, and sometimes that's also good advice. You might just be shortchanging yourself just replacing half of it. And here again, if you took a look here.
So same story. So this part goes through the front wheel bearing and the front hub and splines. It looks very nice. Where the seals run, almost like new. Okay, but now this part on the CV is the part that works the most.
Yeah.
Every single turn, every single bump you go through, it will work. And it's got this cage with the ball bearings.
So also you see here, the bearings, these bearings are already gone a bit blue, the ball.
Yeah. So they run in there, inside that cage. But if I look into the grooves, you can see the metal is starting to break up.
Yeah.
So this is a definite changer.
Yeah, and I think, what's happened here is often the boot comes off, the grease leaks out, and now you're compromised because the lack of grease builds up heat, and it's a lot worse if you're on an expedition and the dust gets in there. It's like grinding paste. So it's something to look at, especially on an independent front suspension where these CV boots are exposed. They are vulnerable. Yeah. Okay. And then, of course, we've got the shaft.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's basically just splines. You can check on this.
Yeah.
But also, if you do your normal checks on a car, water, oil in the morning. Just look underneath the car, because if this leaks, it will throw the whole wheel full of grease. And if you see that,
it's a good sign. You know, when you're looking for telltale signs, we always say a daily check on a vehicle is so critical, and more critical when you're remote, because it's going to give you a big indicator, or sometimes a small indicator, as to what can happen.
Yeah.
And if you took this and it was split, and even if you had to wrap a plastic around it and zip tie it on and take, you know, in a way, it would still save the joint, as opposed to leaving it exposed to the dust, and then by the time you then repair it miles down the road, it's destroyed the CV.
Because this can break 1,000 Ks after your service.
Yeah.
And so for the next 9,000 you drive.
Yeah, and you break it and then you can't get one. So always understand and that's where we talk about a repair kit that I put together for vehicles. The repair kit's designed to patch up things on the car, especially when you're on a long remote expedition and you're looking for something that you need, a zip tie or some tape or some glue or a sealant of sorts. And you know, you've got to make a repair in some or other way. Yeah. So yeah, important to check. So I've got the turbo we've taken out, and we are going to take it to a specialist to look at. But Joubert, on first thoughts, what do you think?
Well, from the outside it looks nice, but yeah,
be nice. I mean, I noticed there's a crack.
The Grand Canyon crack.
Yes.
No, that's quite a big one. So.
Okay, so
it will be a new case.
You know when you take your car to the workshop and they go, how do they do it? You know, that's not a good sound. And you worry. But no, seriously, there is a crack here. So this is cracked right through. So it's compromised. It won't be able to be repaired. We'll have to change this part. It's unfortunate. Yeah. But it's one of those things. And maybe if I'd taken it off earlier, some of the symptoms were there, you know, smoking, you pick up a problem. But there is another, it's just adding. It means I'm getting more power back when I put it back together. I'm very happy for that. Anyway, this will go to the specialists, and the guys are going to look at it. Dup Diesel's got a turbo place, and they're going to go through the whole turbo exchange and look through it. And then the other heart of the vehicle is the injector pump.
Yeah.
This has to go and be done by a specialist, not something that gets done in any workshops. We send this off to a Bosch approved diesel injection specialist. They're going to strip it down, they're going to check it, they're going to calibrate it, replace any worn parts. But what do you normally find on some of the pumps that you've dealt with that are problems?
Well, this is the electronic one, so there's not much you can see from the outside, but the mechanical
pumps, the other ones,
they get a lot of wear on the throttle shaft.
Yeah.
And
and leaks as well. You know, the gaskets get hard and then the rubber seals and they leak.
But yeah, I think when you guys strip this, you actually see how much parts is inside that little thing.
Yeah. No, it's a very complex and very critical to get right. Now, it doesn't help to build an engine and not do the injector pump. But what doesn't get done often is the injectors. Now, I can't tell you here how good these are. These are going to have to go through and get properly tested. And we'll see how well the spray patterns are.
But you see, if you look at the top, if that little part must be flat with the little spray nozzle.
Yeah.
But if that has burnt away like a little
dish,
then also new tips straight away.
So we'll get the specialist to strip these down, look at it. It's something that can and should be serviced more often than people realize. Yeah. And I think what people don't appreciate is that fuel these days does not have the qualities of lubrication it used to have with all the high sulfur. So we've got great fuel for the economy, for the environment, should we say, but it's not kind to your engine. So you do need to think about how you can add lubrication back into the fuel using some of the additives that can help lubricate some of these parts and lubricate the pump. Very important, especially when you get poor quality fuel.
Yeah, Tamer has a great product.
Yeah, it is. It's flash lube. It's basically a product that goes into the fuel. It's mixed with the fuel, and it helps lubricate all these little working parts. So it puts back that lubrication into the fuel, the diesel fuel.
Yeah.
So it's really good. And you actually feel it. You feel it's slightly more economy, and the engine runs a bit smoother. So it's good. We've found great effects on that. Sadly, it's not actually widely used enough in the country. In Africa, I think it's because people don't understand the value of what a product like that can do for your engine. And that's what we're hoping to share with you, is to share how you maintain your diesel fuel injection system. When should you have it looked at? And when you do have it looked at, what can you do when you're driving the vehicle that can keep the engine running better? Like making sure you put good fuel in, a second fuel filter, changing the filters often enough on service intervals.
Yeah.
Yeah, so all good.
Yeah.
Expensive to repair. Well guys, that was a long video, I know, and it's the reason for putting information out there is to try and make it valuable to you. But our next step is to take some of the critical components to the specialists, and we're going to start off with Dirk. Dirk owns Stub Diesel and Turbo Exchange, and the two critical components, the turbo and the fuel injection system, which is the injector pump and the injectors, need to be looked at by specialists. So if you want to find out more about the Overlander or our sponsors, be sure to look at our website.